In 1967, soldiers in the jungles of Vietnam were dying, not from bullets, but from a strain of malaria that had defeated every drug modern science could throw at it. Researchers screened over 240,000 synthetic chemical compounds. Every single one of them failed. The answer, when it finally came, wasn't found in a laboratory. It was found on a 1,600-year-old scroll written by a Taoist physician who had been dead for 16 centuries. And the woman who found it tested the unknown cure on herself before giving it to anyone else. That story, and the ancient medical tradition behind it, is what this video is about. Because while medieval European doctors were still bleeding patients and wrapping them in red cloth to chase away smallpox, physicians on the other side of the world were inhaling vaccines, performing surgery under general anesthesia, and extracting hormones from human urine. Welcome back to Silk Road Annals. Today, we're opening the vault on the ancient Chinese medical secrets that saved millions of lives and completely rewrote the history of science. Part 1. Cracking the Code of Immunity. 1. The 800-year head start on vaccines. For most of human history, smallpox was the ultimate grim reaper. A gruesome, highly contagious virus that left survivors blind, infertile, or permanently disfigured. Chinese texts described it as early as 1122 BCE. But unlike most civilizations, the ancient Chinese didn't just accept the slaughter. They engineered a defense. By the 10th century, during the Liao dynasty, Chinese physicians had developed a systematic technique called variolation. They collected scabs from patients who had survived a mild case of smallpox. But they understood that raw scabs were too dangerous, so they dried them in hot sun for weeks, a brilliant step that weakened or attenuated the virus's virulence. Then they ground the dried scabs into a fine powder and, using a silver or bamboo tube, blew it directly into the nostrils of a healthy person. The logic was pure science before the word existed. By introducing a weakened pathogen through the nasal mucosa, the body mounted a defense. A mild fever, a mortality rate of just 1 to 2%, and gained lifelong immunity. It wasn't until the early 18th century that Lady Mary Wortley Montagu observed a variation of this method in the Ottoman Empire and brought it to the British royal court, laying the groundwork for Edward Jenner's cowpox vaccine in 1796. That's over 800 years after China had already figured it out. And the Chinese didn't stop at smallpox. 2. Ge rabies cure, 1,500 years before Pasteur rabies. Once symptoms appear, it is virtually 100% fatal. We all know Louis Pasteur's heroic invention of the rabies vaccine in 1885. But 1,500 years before Pasteur ever looked through a microscope, a Chinese physician-philosopher named Ge Hong had already proposed a treatment based on the same underlying logic. Ge Hong advised that if a person was bitten by a mad dog, they should kill the dog, extract its brain tissue, and apply it directly to the wound. It sounds barbaric, but consider what's actually happening. Rabies is a neurotropic virus. It concentrates in the brain and nervous system. The brain tissue of an infected dog contains dead or naturally weakened viral particles. By exposing the patient's immune system to those particles at the wound site, Ge Hong was creating a primitive post-exposure prophylaxis. He didn't have the vocabulary of immunology, but he had the concept. And that same concept is the exact foundation Pasteur built his vaccine on, a millennium and a half later. Remember the name Ge Hong? He's about to appear again in a story that won a Nobel Prize. Part 2. The body's hidden chemistry. 3. The autumn mineral. Endocrinology, 1,000 years early. Here's a question nobody thinks to ask. How do you extract invisible hormones from human urine using medieval technology? As early as the 2nd century BCE, Chinese iatrochemists were doing exactly that. By the 11th century, they had perfected a process for extracting steroid and pituitary sex hormones from urine to treat impotence and hormonal imbalances. They called the purified crystals Qi, the autumn mineral. The process was a marvel of empirical chemistry. They collected massive quantities of urine, sometimes over 150 gallons, from young, healthy donors. To separate the active hormones from urea and salts, they used chemical precipitants, gypsum, or the juice of soap beans. The saponins in those soap beans are the exact same compounds that the modern biochemist Adolf Windaus used in 1909 to precipitate steroid hormones. Then came the critical step. They placed the raw hormone paste into a sealed earthenware still and heated it. Because steroid hormones sublime, they transition directly from solid to gas without becoming liquid. The pure hormones vaporized and recrystallized as a glittering white frost on the cool lid of the vessel. Physicians mixed these crystals with dates or wine and prescribed them as oral medication. The West wouldn't isolate sex hormones until the 1920s. Chinese physicians had been prescribing them for 1,000 years. 4. The thyroid mystery. 4,700 years of marine medicine. Imagine living in an ancient inland village where people mysteriously develop massive, swollen lumps on their necks. We know today this is a goiter, an enlarged thyroid caused by iodine deficiency. For centuries in Europe, it was blamed on bad water. But 4,700 years ago, around 2700 BCE, Chinese physicians were already prescribing seaweed and burnt sea sponges as treatment. They didn't know what iodine was. The element wouldn't be discovered in the West until 1820. But they had observed empirically that eating marine plants shrank the tumors. Then, by 652 CE, the Taoist physician Sun Shi Miao pushed even further. He began prescribing the thyroid glands of sheep and deer to goitrous patients. Think about what that means. He was performing hormone replacement therapy, providing the exact animal thyroxine that the human body was failing to produce over 1,000 years before Western endocrinology existed as a field. Part 3. The surgeon and the detective. 5. Hua Tuo's comatose concoction. Surgery under anesthesia. 200 CE. If you needed surgery in the ancient world, you were in for a nightmare. No painkillers, no sedation, just a leather strap between your teeth and the hope that you'd pass out from the pain before the worst part. Unless you lived in China. During the turbulent end of the Eastern Han dynasty, around 140 to 208 CE, a physician named Hua Tuo recognized something radical. When disease sat deep inside the body, beyond the reach of acupuncture needles, the only option was to cut. To make that possible, he invented mafesin, cannabis boiling powder. He mixed this herbal compound with wine and had the patient drink it. Within moments, the patient fell into a deep, comatose, insensate state. Modern pharmacologists believe mafesin was a precisely calculated blend of botanical neurotoxins. Datura stramonium, which provides scopolamine for amnesia and deep sedation. Aconitum, a powerful toxin that blocks nerve conduction. And cannabis for pain relief. Under its effects, Hua Tuo opened the abdomen, cut into the intestines, removed diseased tissue, washed the organs, and sutured the patient closed. Within a month, his patients were fully healed. This was 1,600 years before the famous 1846 ether anesthesia demonstration in Massachusetts. Hua Tuo's story ends in tragedy. The paranoid warlord Cao Cao, one of the most powerful men in Chinese history, had Hua Tuo executed. His medical scrolls were burned, and the exact formula of mafesin was lost forever. 6. The Flies of Justice, the world's first CSI. The year is 1247. A peasant in a rural Chinese village has been found hacked to death with a hand sickle. No witnesses. A village full of suspects. Now, in 13th century Europe, the standard method of determining guilt was trial by ordeal, making the suspect hold a red-hot iron and waiting to see if God healed the burns. But the Chinese magistrate investigating this murder had a very different method. He ordered every peasant in the village to bring their sickle and lay it on the ground in the town square. Then he waited. For a long time, nothing happened. Then, a swarm of bright, metallic green blowflies descended on the square. They didn't land randomly. They swarmed one specific sickle and completely ignored the rest. Even though the murderer had wiped the blade clean, microscopic remnants of blood and tissue remained trapped in the micro fissures of the metal. The flies could smell the decomposing proteins. Faced with this undeniable biological evidence, the owner of that sickle confessed. This case was recorded by Song Chi in his groundbreaking work, The Washing Away of Wrongs, the world's first forensic science manual. Song Chi taught coroners how to wash dead bodies to determine the exact cause of death, how to distinguish a staged suicide from a real one, and how to use insect behavior as evidence. European forensic science wouldn't produce anything comparable for another 400 years. Part 4. Ancient Scrolls, Modern Miracles. 7. The 1,600-year-old scroll that won a Nobel Prize. Now we return to where we started. Vietnam, 1967, and a strain of malaria that was killing soldiers faster than the bullets were. The situation was so desperate that China launched a secret military drug discovery program called Project 523. Worldwide, researchers screened over 240,000 synthetic compounds. Every one of them failed. Enter Youyou. A quiet, methodical pharmacologist, she did something no one else thought to do. She went to the ancient texts. She combed through thousands of classical Chinese medical manuscripts, hunting for any reference to fever cures. And she found one, in a 4th century manual written by our old friend Ge Hong, prescribing sweet wormwood, Qing Hao, for intermittent fevers. Her team extracted the plant's compounds using traditional boiling methods. It failed completely, but Youyou refused to give up. She reread the 1,600-year-old scroll. Ge Hong's specific instruction was to soak the herb in cold water and wring out the juice. Cold water, not boiling. That detail changed the world. Youyou realized that heat was destroying the active compound. She switched to a low-temperature ether extraction and successfully isolated Artemisinin. Then, to prove it was safe when no one else was willing to take the risk, she tested the unknown drug on herself. Today, Artemisinin-based therapies are the World Health Organization's first-line treatment for malaria across the globe. They have saved millions of lives. And in 2015, Youyou was awarded the Nobel Prize in Medicine for reading a scroll that had been sitting on a shelf for 16 centuries. 8. The poison that cures. Arsenic versus leukemia. Ancient Chinese physicians operated on a profound philosophical principle, Yi Du Gong Du, using poison to fight poison. As far back as 200 BCE, medical texts documented the use of arsenic to treat skin diseases. By the 16th century, it was being applied to gangrene and swollen lymph nodes. Then, in the 1970s, doctors in Harbin, China, working during the Cultural Revolution with almost no resources, began testing these ancient arsenic formulations on cancer patients. What they discovered stunned the medical world. Pure arsenic trioxide didn't just kill cancer cells randomly. It specifically targeted acute promyelocytic leukemia, APL, one of the deadliest blood cancers. It forced the mutated cells to mature and die off naturally. Today, thanks to this ancient principle, APL has gone from one of the most lethal leukemias to one of the most curable. An oral arsenic formulation developed in Hong Kong now achieves a 97% overall survival rate, from death sentence to near certain cure, because someone in ancient China decided that poison, properly understood, could be medicine. Conclusion. From sniffing dried smallpox scabs in the 10th century, to mapping the nervous system through sheer observation, to extracting hormones with earthenware stills, ancient China operated on a level of clinical sophistication that the West wouldn't match for 800 to 1,500 years. And the proof sits in one image. A quiet pharmacologist in 1967, alone in a laboratory, holding a cup of unknown liquid she extracted from a plant that a Taoist monk recommended 16 centuries earlier, and drinking it herself because she believed the ancient text was right. Youyou was right, Ge Hong was right, and that 1,600-year-old scroll is still saving lives today. It makes you wonder how many other answers are sitting on shelves somewhere, waiting for someone to read them carefully enough. If these stories surprised you, do me a favor, hit subscribe and ring that bell so you don't miss the next episode of Silk Road Annals. And tell me in the comments, what ancient technology or forgotten remedy do you think modern science should investigate next? Until next time, keep exploring the history that shapes our world.